another fabulous interview here at the Awaken Your Potential Summit. I'm your host, Kym Coco, and I have Dr. Dean Shrock here with me, and he has served as Director of Mind-Body Medicine for a physician management group of 40 cancer centers, and here he taught and researched a wellness program that improved survival with cancer. This led to his co-authoring of the Mind-Body Medicine chapter in Dr. Andrew Weil's book, Integrative Oncology, and updating his program for cancer patients, which he calls Living and Thriving, a Mind-Body-Spirit program for wellness. So Dr. Shrock discovered that one thing we're all looking for is peace of mind. And he talks about, in his books, Doctor's Orders, Go Fishing, and Why Love Heals, how to find that peace of mind. And we're going to pick his brain for some information today. And literally for the past 30 years, he's been studying and experiencing and dedicating his life to writing and teaching how to find your own true joy, greater health, and deeper sense of inner love. So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Kym, for the invitation to be part of your teleseminar.
So how did you become interested in why love heals?
Well, that came out of my work when I was Director of Mind-Body Medicine for these cancer centers, and I was teaching a program based on a lot of prior training, but also my internship and work with Dr. Carl Simonton, who was a radiation oncologist and pioneered the use of guided imagery with the use of cancer. But his program was really much, much more about having a strong will to live, doing what brought you the greatest joy and meaning in your life. So after I had worked with Carl, we agreed to collaborate, and then I became this Director of Mind-Body Medicine and developed my own program, which was a model of his program. And what I found, though, in encouraging people to really identify and work to meet their own interests and needs and values is that they found it too selfish, that they really couldn't do that. I was totally surprised by this. In a way, I thought I was giving them a license to steal. If you could imagine going to the doctor and the doctor essentially prescribed for you as part of your treatment, you need to do what brings you the greatest joy in your life as part of your treatment. But anyhow, their conditioning was such that they thought everyone and everything else is supposed to come first. And when my patients ended up living longer than those just getting conventional medical treatment, I couldn't comfortably say it was the will to live and that there must be something else. And that's when I was allowed to recollect on my clinical experience by the editors who published my research. And I comfortably told them it was because I had this other huge insight given to me by the people I worked with. It wasn't any particular coping skill I taught them that made the difference in why they lived longer, fared better. It was because they felt listened to and cared for and supported. And so that's what really got my attention. How could that be true? How could something that it makes sense logically, but, as a researcher, as a scientist, as, someone who's a licensed healthcare professional, how do you really say and support with research that they lived longer because they felt loved and cared for? So that was what really drove me to study this and to write this book, Why Love Heals.
So how do you define love?
Well, that gets a little deeper into my personal study into quantum physics, but also as I explored more also that quantum physics and, I don't want to say religion, but spirituality, or philosophic systems that essentially promote, and attempt to determine who we are, why we're here, where we're going, is that it always came up love. But what was fascinating is that in quantum physics, that at the deepest level of the stuff of the universe, when we get even below subatomic matter to the very, very essential stuff, it's really formless. It's only potential energy. But the qualities of that quantum field are essentially qualities of love, compassion, harmony, order, in complete cooperation. And so, in the end, everything really is love. The universe is held together by this glue of love. And when you are aligned with this truth of who you are, that is actually a definition of self-love. But love is really the experience and fact of oneness.
And when you say oneness, what do you mean by that?
The idea that everything is connected, that at the quantum level, there is no cause and effect, which is extremely hard to grasp. If you can imagine a beginning that had no beginning, that has always been, and even in wonderful research done throughout the last century, but in 1997 in particular at the University of Geneva, they actually split a proton in half. I don't even know how you can do that. We're talking about something so very small. And then they put these halves into an optic pathway where they were separated by 7 miles. And Kym, whatever stimulus they applied to one half happened instantaneously to the other 7 miles away. There was no time lapse. Everything at the quantum level is absolutely connected. We are all one. In fact, that fascinated me, and I knew this, what I'm about to tell you, before I began my more in-depth study of quantum physics, and that is when I was attempting to make sense of suffering in my work as a psychologist. I first worked with people having chronic pain and recovering from strokes, is that I discovered that religions, one, is partly my sense of humor, but the truth, religions disagree on almost everything. But they managed to agree on 2 primary things I found. And one of them is that we are one with God. That actually is not a radical or a controversial position within all major religious or philosophical systems. And quantum physics actually has given science to support that notion, which I still find, when you really think about it, that we are God, one with God, or that everything is this God energy expressing in form, that's pretty big.
So then, why does love heal?
Well, because I'm going to give you an analogy with electricity. When electricity is flowing optimally with the least amount of resistance, it's called in phase. In fact, whenever an electrician actually attempts to measure the flow of electricity, it's actually measuring the resistance. Anyhow, when we are in phase with the truth of who we are, God or complete harmony, order, compassion, so forth, then this life force energy that's been called many names. So scientifically, we might call it a quantum force, a life force, Ki, Chi, Prana, Holy Spirit. When you are aligned with the qualities of love, you allow for the optimal flow of this life force energy, and then relative to health, health is simply then a natural consequence.
So in essence, we're releasing our resistance to that all-present force of love, life force energy, prana, etc.
Right. When your thoughts, feelings, behaviors are essentially virtuous, and when I say virtuous, I don't mean in terms of good or bad, but a wonderful book was written titled Character, Strengths, and Virtues, where the authors, Seligman and Peterson, looked at all of the philosophic literature and all of the psychology literature to attempt to find the positive aspects of health. We so focus on what's wrong when we give someone a diagnosis. It's okay, always what's wrong with you. And in this process, they identified 6 core virtues that were ubiquitous across time, across these cultures. And so when you are experiencing truth, beauty, wisdom, transcendence, these virtuous qualities, that's when, honestly, they even concluded it affected survival of the species. Somehow it does. But I believe it's because, again, then we are expressing ourselves in the most authentic way. And I'm sure you and your listeners will have heard this before, that what is really key is that we live authentically. Well, you will never be more authentic than when you are living love.
I'm curious about your take on how does love relate to the heart specifically?
Well, when you are experiencing this optimal flow of life force energy, it is going to affect every organ and system in the body, to be certain. When you talk about the physical heart, I probably tend to think about the Institute of Heart Math and the wonderful research they have done demonstrating a mind-body relationship, but specifically the power of the heart. In fact, even scientifically, we know that the heart is more powerful than the brain and actually probably runs the show in a much greater way than we tend to think the brain does. But I think the heart metaphorically, and in fact in terms of when we think of acupuncture or energy systems in the body, is probably the key, or sometimes it's called the chakra or energy center, that is most identified with this deeper sense of who we are and wanting to align ourselves with our heart, which the implication is with love.
And the reason I ask that is only because when you talk about the thoughts, it implies the brain and the thinking and the conscious mind of focusing on those virtues of truth, beauty, wisdom, but then also the feeling component, which naturally revolves around the heart, and how both of those, the thoughts and feelings, really are combined to affect physical health.
Right. Well, when you are aligned with your truth, this deep sense of who you really are, and for those who meditate, you will really understand this, or have had a transcendent experience like a near-death experience, is that it's really incomparable. And honestly, it's ineffable. It's really beyond description. It's just this greatest sense of harmony and synchronicity and sugar and spice and everything nice, beyond description.
And it's all energy.
It is energy, but then we experience it with our physical senses, which severely limits what we're experiencing, but still when you do, and there's a wonderful story written by Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor in her book, My Stroke of Insight, that I think explains this fairly well. She firstly is a neuroanatomist, so she's a brain scientist, and unfortunately she had a stroke where her left hemisphere of her brain was severely compromised, and so now she was living primarily with the function of her right hemisphere, and these hemispheres function very differently. The left is much more oriented in terms of categorizing and judging and thinks in terms of separation and individuality, where the right brain hemisphere is the intuitive, the one that lives in the moment, very creative. And so when she lost the use of her reasoning and logical mind, as she would say, she now found herself living in this sea of energy that was one of extreme bliss. And she said if she could describe what this was, in a word, it was compassion, and the feeling was joy. So that when, again, we are able to access, through meditation in particular, this other reality, the left hemisphere knows a very different reality than the right, then I think that's when we come to a greater understanding of also what we might say is our heart's knowing versus our brain's knowing.
Can you explain how consciousness creates our reality? And is that different than the heart?
It is. Again, at the very deepest level, there's only potential energy. It is actually formless. And it only takes form when we attempt to measure it, when it's observed. And so that's when consciousness is introduced. So consciousness actually determines or creates reality. And I remember when I first read and heard about this many years ago, and it sounded all so new age. But the fact is, the truth of it is, and at least 4 physicists who were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics between the early 1900s and the 1930s, all were concluding this very thing, is that we are all one, and that our consciousness, in fact, determines the form of however this wave form of potential energy becomes a particle. And then a collective consciousness then goes on to increase the probability of that taking form, or how much more quickly it would begin to take a form.
So when we're creating this reality, everything is just feedback. We're not really a victim to anything.
No, and that is really a mouthful, and for some people very scary to understand the personal responsibility involved with that statement, is that everything in your life, everything, is a reflection of you or our collective consciousness. We've created it. So even when people talk about archetypes, they've been created by consciousness. And if we want to change our life and want to change the world, and even something as big as an archetype, just change the way you think and feel about things.
So is that why you wrote the book, Go Fishing, meaning Follow Our Bliss?
Well, I wrote that for a different reason because, as I said earlier, I had worked with Carl Simonton, and prior to that, I had met a man who became my very best friend and business partner and really a mentor. And he taught me much more about life and love, even though I was a slow learner at first. It was hard to just really grasp the power of the mind and what he was really saying and teaching. But my personal experience with guided imagery, where I was able to do some phenomenal things early on, really got my attention. But the doctor's orders, Go Fishing, was really about do what brings you the greatest joy and meaning in your life. When I was in this position as director of mind-body medicine for the cancer centers and trying to teach about the will to live, I just found it more meaningful and easier for people to grasp some of the ideas rather than talking just in terms of research and science, and talk about the idea of doing what it is, again, that brings you the greatest joy and meaning in your life. And the image of fly fishing, to me, was very meaningful for me and for them. Actually, where I lived, literally, when I was in Pennsylvania at first, the town was called Fisherman's Paradise. And behind my house was the longest and best-known trout stream in all of Pennsylvania. So every day I could see and would see people there fly fishing, and it was this beautiful, serene image. And trout fishing is a very big deal in most of Pennsylvania. In fact, deer hunting is just as big, at least, where they actually closed public schools the first day of buck season and doe season. And except that trout season opens on Saturday, I assure you they would close it the first day of trout season as well. So Doctor's Orders Go Fishing was just something that I created and became very meaningful for them, because even if I had met and worked with someone for a certain time and then years later ran into them, one of the first things they usually said was, "Hey, I've been going fishing." And that's why I knew I had to keep that as the title of my book, because people remembered it, and that was the whole point.
Now, you mentioned earlier that when you told people to go and experience joy, oftentimes it felt too selfish. So how do we transition from being conditioned to put others before ourselves to saying, okay, I'm okay to nurture myself and I don't have to feel guilty doing it?
Yeah. Well, I gave them all the logic I'm going to give you, and still they didn't do it. But I think it's at least the best I could do was to give them some common sense examples. And one of the first things I learned this way was when I was a staff psychologist in a rehab hospital before my work with cancer. And what I found was that people were fortunate if they could be discharged to home rather than to, say, a nursing home. But then it was going to become a major lifestyle change for the caregiver for that person. And so what I found was it was extremely common for people to call the caregiver of the stroke, the person who had the stroke, and say, hey, I'm going to come over and sit with this person so you can get out of the house. You still need to go to the store, go to church, resume a relatively normal lifestyle. The idea is that if you create this very imbalanced life, in fact, you're much more prone to wear yourself down and then be no good to anybody. And then similarly, I remember one day a woman who I knew really well, I was going into the hospital. She was coming out, and we were saying hello, and she told me that she had just sat up 3 straight days and nights with her mother in the hospital. And I said, good, keep it up. You'll be in there with her. Now, I knew that I was being very direct, but I'm trying to make a point here. It's like the idea on the airplane where you're told to put your own oxygen mask on first. Is that you have to understand that there's got to be a greater balance in your life, or, in fact, it's only a matter of time before you create your own health problems or imbalances. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So I tried to give them big doses of common sense around why this was essential, and beyond then trying to explain the concept of oneness to them, although early on I didn't have the same grasp of quantum physics and chose not to go as deep into maybe a more spiritual element. But I would say to people now, if you really understand the truth of who you are, both scientifically and from a spiritual perspective, then you would only think about taking care of yourself, because one, it's going to show up in your own body and life, and two, it's going to show up in your world.